If you've got a spreadsheet full of vendor data and you're just sitting there dreading having to enter each one manually, I've got some really great news. You don't have to. QuickBooks has a bulk import feature for vendors, and today I'm going to walk you through that whole process and how you can get this information into your books as quickly and painlessly as possible. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, one thing that I do recommend is before you do any kind of import like what we're discussing, whether it's bringing in customer or vendor data, that you go and visit your customer or vendor center to get an idea of the names that are already in there. While QuickBooks does generally catch duplicates when they come in with a bulk import like this, there are times when something like that might not be caught. Maybe the display name is different in QuickBooks, or maybe there is some additional data that means that QuickBooks isn't going to associate a vendor with the new vendor you're trying to import, okay? So being aware of that and trying to make sure that you're minimizing duplicates before you trust QuickBooks to do a scan is always a good idea. Now, let's go ahead and take a look before we get into this to see where we can find our existing vendor information. So if you are already a QuickBooks user and you have vendors in play already, there are a few different places you can do this. You can go into the vendor center, and we're going to get in there in a moment, but you can also go to your reports screen here. And if you type in vendor up at the top, you can see there is a vendor contact list that you can use and have access to for your business. So let's go ahead and check that out right now. Now, this is the list of vendors that I currently have in my business. And what you can see, and it wouldn't surprise me if this is the same for a lot of you, is that a lot of them don't actually have phone number or address information, okay? The way that our businesses work in this digital day and age is that we're not often sending invoices physically in the mail. We're not often dropping checks into the mail to send to our vendors, right? We are sending things electronically and paying things electronically. So the vendor information and customer information and what is truly necessary and essential has definitely changed a bit, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. Back when I first started in accounting, you genuinely needed all of this information. In fact, I used to send faxes to get information about vendors and customers, for example, to extend them terms, right? Faxing when I started in this industry was still a standard practice. So that probably tells you a little bit more about how old I am than I would otherwise want you to know. But we don't necessarily need all of that information in this day and age, right? That being said, I am never going to sit here and say that I don't want to have as much information as possible about both my customers and vendors, because you never know when you're going to need to pick up a phone and call somebody, or when you're going to want to send out a mailing, right? Some people do still receive those, and it can really set you apart as a business owner if you're doing something like that. So it never hurts to have lots of information. In fact, more than you think you might want. So we can see here, this is our current vendor list, okay? Now, I'm going to be going into detail at a later date about how we can kind of customize some of these reports, but this is giving us a lot of information right now. We have vendor, company, phone number, email, name, billing address, account number, if applicable, of course, tax ID number, if applicable, and whether or not we are opting to track them for 1099 purposes, okay? So this is a really great report if you want to get a quick overview of everything that you have in your vendor center in a really nice grid format to really get a quick handle on things, okay? But we can also go and look at this information in our vendor center, which we can get to by going over here, all apps, expenses and bills, and then vendors. Okay, this brings us into our vendor center, and our vendor center is going to be pretty similar to our customer center from the standpoint of it's going to give us some information about what's going on in our business, kind of broad stroke stuff, as well as all of the detail of who our vendors are down below. Okay. So you can see we have, no purchase orders, we have some overdue items, and nothing has been paid in the last 30 days. Now, one thing to keep in mind, this isn't necessarily going to capture everything. If we're just classifying things straight from the bank feed, and if there are no bills or things associated with it, The amount paid here in this screen might not be reflective of those things. Okay. That being said, this is a sample file. So sometimes there are periods of time where I don't have any data in there for a little while, and then I enter a whole bunch and get all caught up at once. Okay. So how do we add more vendors by bulk here in the vendor center? We go up to this top right-hand corner up here where it says new vendor, but instead of clicking on the new vendor button, we're going to click on this caret just to the right of that. And it's going to say import vendors, okay? Now, there are other options here. We are going to get into all of these at a later time, but for the time being, we are just going to do a bulk import of vendors into QuickBooks Online. And from here, if you have ever imported customers before, you're going to start to see some real parallels in what we're working with, okay? The overall process is very much the same. You're going to import a file of some kind, right? In this case, I have an Excel file ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and browse and find that file. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, if you didn't already have an Excel file available, you could download a sample file to make sure that your data is in a format that is going to translate well to this, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and browse here and get that file in. And here we go. So now that I have that sheet selected, I can hit next down here in the bottom right-hand corner. And this right here is again going to be very similar to what we're seeing in other imports in QuickBooks Online. Now, just because there is a green check mark next to this does not mean that we want to just rubber stamp it and send it on through. We have to look at this and ensure that what QuickBooks has assumed is the match is actually the match. Okay, so we can see here we have name, but in my file it's called first name, last name. Okay, that one is totally fine. Company is company, email, phone, mobile, fax, those are all the same. So I can go ahead and leave those alone. There are some other slight differences here, right? So for example, we see zip code is just zip on my Excel sheet. That makes perfect sense to me. I'm not going to stress about that kind of a difference. But it's an example of where we just want to be aware of what's being imported and making sure that QuickBooks is picking the correct mapping to get the data into the right place. There is nothing more frustrating than going through an import like this and accidentally switching where some information is supposed to go, right? For example, if it wasn't really clear that it was phone, mobile, and fax, maybe it's called cell, or maybe there is, primary phone or something like that. You want to be sure that you're sending it to the correct place, because it would really be unfortunate to have everybody's cell phone numbers in the primary number if they had business numbers that they wanted you to be contacting, okay? So keeping that all in mind is really important when you are bringing data in. Okay, now I have looked at this Excel sheet and I know that I don't have opening balance for any of these vendors. I don't have an opening balance date, and I don't have a tax ID number for any of these vendors. So that is all fine, okay? But if you knew that you had that information in your Excel sheet, you might want to go ahead and select the drop down and try to find that data, okay? Now, there really is no place to add things like notes, and QuickBooks actually doesn't have a place where you can add an account number. So if you do have account numbers on your vendor Excel sheet and you want those in QuickBooks, you will unfortunately have to go in and enter those manually, okay? But other than that, it's going to pull all of this data and get it into QuickBooks for us in a relatively seamless way. So now that I've confirmed all of the mapping is correct, I can go ahead and hit next. And then it takes me to this lovely grid where I can see all of the information and I can figure out whether or not what is in here is accurate. Now, one thing here, this was red, and I can see if I mouse over it, it tells me invalid character found. So if I click in here and look through, and that's interesting. I don't see any characters in here at all. So that is kind of an odd situation. It's possible that it is too many characters for QuickBooks. So what I'll do, it's a California Association of Bookkeeping Professionals. So I'll put California Association of Bookkeeping Professionals, okay? And we'll leave it at that. It has gone ahead and accepted that. So it is entirely possible that I could go in later and edit it, but for whatever reason, QuickBooks flagged something in there as not being valid, okay? Additionally, the nice thing here is that if you have some information that you didn't put in the Excel sheet or that wasn't in the Excel sheet, but you have available to you right now, you could always add it in here. So for example, let's say that I actually have a mobile number for Monica Lee that I want to add to this. Okay, I could put in 916, and I just made up a string of random numbers there. But I can now add some information here and it will be imported into the file, okay? Now, the other thing here is if for whatever reason I had somebody on the Excel sheet that I actually didn't want to bring into QuickBooks at this point, I could uncheck their row and you can see how it turned gray. That means it's not going to bring them in because I unmarked their information. I can go ahead and mark it again though to say that I do want them to be brought in. All right. Once I've gone through all this, once I've kind of double checked the information to see if there's anything obviously out of place, once I've added anything that I would like to see, I am all set to go ahead and select import here, okay? Okay, so it looks like QuickBooks will not let me put anything in that only has a company name associated with it, which makes sense because QuickBooks usually, when you are going through the process, automatically assigns the name when you enter in a company name, right? But since we're doing this import, we have to have something there. So I just went ahead and copied Golden State Couriers over to the name because that is their business name. And I can now go ahead and import this data. So it's telling me that 7 of 7 vendors were successfully imported. Now, usually that is the stage where if there were a duplicate of any kind, QuickBooks would flag it, okay? Now, I always say this, I know I probably sound like a broken record, trust but verify, right? Sometimes QuickBooks is really great about catching duplicates and sometimes it isn't. There are times when if a name is slightly different or if it decides that not enough of the information is in common or shared, it might go ahead and add something anyway. And you don't want to have 2 different vendor profiles on hand, right? You want to have one vendor profile for each vendor so that all of the information is being tracked for that vendor in the same place, okay? So now we can see I have a few more vendors in my customer center here, okay? And we can see I have more information over here because the information that I imported was more comprehensive than the manual data entry that I had been doing when I was just classifying transactions in my bank transactions tab, okay? So now I can also go and run the vendor contact sheet basically and see these changes showing there as well. So let's go ahead and check that out. If I go over here and again to standard reports and then type in vendor contact list is the third option, okay? So now you can see I have additional people and additional information on my vendor contact list, and it is reflective of that information that I had imported, okay? Now, just importing information doesn't mean that you can't accidentally have something end up in the wrong place. And if that's the case, it's always good to go in and do management on your vendors, same as on your customers, right? If your vendor moves offices, you want to be sure that you're updating their address. If you have a specific person's email and they are no longer with the company, you want to be sure that you get the contact information for the new person that you'll be dealing with in their office. This is really important to maintaining good vendor relations. And we want to do that and we want to prioritize that the same way we are prioritizing customer relations. Making sure that we're paying our vendors on time means that we are going to continue to have good relationships with them. And that is all predicated on having accurate data in our file so that we are getting all of this done. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Holly from Accrual Mistress Bookkeeping and Consulting. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments.